We just heard a very rare and unusual evening briefing from the FBI director and the director of national intelligence. John Ratcliffe, in that case, said that they wanted to alert the public that Iran and Russia have taken actions to compromise our electoral security. He said voter registration information obtained to try and communicate false information to voters, warning that that is not, in fact, the case, and that Iran spoofed emails, he said, to try and damage President Trump. A video also suggesting fraudulent ballots in a desperate attempt by desperate adversaries. However, we heard from FBI Director Christopher Wray that there are unverified claims that votes are being thrown away and that those are simply not true. He also encouraged everyone to be thoughtful, caring consumers of information online. Now, to dig in deeper to all of this and what we've heard is senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. She joins us on the phone now from Washington. Catherine, first of all, what do you make of the FBI bringing this information to the American voters just days before the end of voting here in this country?
Well, what I know through my reporting here at CBS News is that this was a very sudden detection and development by the election security officials, Homeland Security, and the FBI. And these leads were run down really in what amounted to 24 hours. And they concluded that in this particular case, there had been an accessing of voter rolls by Iran and also Russia, and that Iran was using this information to wage what they call an information operation, which is an attempt to sway the opinion of voters. And in this case, while he didn't explicitly state it to reporters, Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, he's referring to these emails purportedly from the group Proud Boys that was targeting Democrats in Florida and other states, threatening them to vote for President Trump. And my assessment is that this administration wants to get way out front on what they have concluded is significant efforts by foreign adversaries to interfere in the U.S. election, specifically in this case, Iran. But they also noted for reporters that Russia has the same capability, but they have not used it to this point in time.
Catherine, I thought it was very interesting to hear, I thought, different tones coming from the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, and the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe. What did you make of how they divided up what they wanted to tell Americans tonight?
Well, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, is the nation's intelligence chief, and he oversees more than a dozen agencies. So he gave what I would describe as the big picture, that we're days out from the election and that the administration, from his perspective, is being out front and very transparent with the public about efforts to interfere in the election, sort of a departure from what we saw in 2016. And he also made the point that these are efforts designed, in this case, to denigrate President Trump, who is seeking re-election. The FBI director really took a more technical tone, if you will, really explaining the role of law enforcement. The FBI is, if you will, sort of the boots on the ground when they're doing these investigations, when they're looking at what they call malign influence operations or malign actors from foreign states. And this is also where this relatively new component at Homeland Security called CISA comes into play, because they're really the interconnection of the FBI, Homeland Security, and cyber. They sit atop that, and they will be the ones who made the early identification and then also helped member agencies run it to ground. So to sum it up, FBI director would have been sort of the boots on the ground, working with the cyber element within Homeland Security, and the Director of National Intelligence was giving the big picture that this administration will be transparent leading into the election, and that they're calling out these countries by name, which is also new. They're singling out Iran, saying they've already used these measures to try and influence American voters, but they're also sending a warning shot to the Russians that they know they have access to this information. They could take a similar step as the Iranians, and they're really warning them against that. I think Director Ratcliffe said there will be a cost to pursuing these operations leading up to the election.
It was interesting. We heard both men try and reassure American voters in the integrity of our electoral system. Ratcliffe saying you can be confident that your votes are secure. Wray dismissing really these unverified claims that votes were being thrown away. What do you make of the fact that we've heard actually from President Trump some of these unverified claims and doubts about the electoral process in the United States and election security? In some ways, were they actually trying to reassure American voters after the president himself was making claims that, in Wray's words, were unverified?
Right. So I think this is, you've really sort of hit the button on what is, I think, one of the most important divides that you see between the White House and specifically the FBI director on this issue of whether mail-in balloting is subject to widespread voter fraud. And the FBI director recently testified that historically that is not the case. What you're also, I think, picking up on is another important thread, which is how this election is different than the election in 2016. The fundamental difference is that about 92% of the votes cast this year will have some kind of what they call auditable paper trail. So there's a backup record. So if there is a question about a penetration of a voter roll or a penetration of a voting system, there's going to be a backup so that they can physically go back and see how the votes were cast. And that 92% is a significant jump over 2016. And just to sort of draw a line under this, because I think folks at home need to understand this. What they were not saying today is that there was a penetration of the voting databases or election systems that would result in a change in the vote outcome on November 3rd. That's not what they were saying. What they were saying is that they access information about voters and they use that information to target individuals as part of an operation by a foreign government to sway the view of American voters, in this case to intimidate them and try and force them to vote for President Trump.
I think that that's a very important point to underscore there, Catherine, that the message that we're receiving from our federal authorities tonight are that while foreign governments, specifically Russia and Iran, are trying to mess with American voters through a variety of outlets, including spoofing emails, voter intimidation, misinformation online, that they said that fundamentally our electoral processes are in fact secure, and what they were saying was to be aware that these foreign entities are trying to mess with American voters, to sow discord, to sow chaos, and that all of us need to be more thoughtful and caring consumers of information online and stop the spread of misinformation.
Just one final
thoughts, Catherine?
Just final thought. You know, as we're heading into the final days of this campaign for intelligence officials and Homeland Security and the FBI, this is really the period that is the most dangerous, because this is the period where they've been anticipating heightened activity from foreign actors. What we have not seen in 2020 that we saw in 2016 was the probing of these election structures with the idea that you could scramble the data or somehow change the data on election day. They haven't seen successful penetrations of these voting systems. But tonight what they confirmed is what they've been expecting: interference to influence Americans, to sway voter opinion, and to insert themselves into the democratic process. And I think what we saw this evening was an effort by the Director of National Intelligence as well as the FBI Director to try and strip the politics out of this. One of the things that really folks need to remember is that for a country like Russia or Iran, this is always much bigger than just a candidate or one election cycle. It's about a policy to denigrate and undermine confidence in the democratic process, because that's ultimately the end state in these operations.
All right, Catherine, very important points. Thank you for joining us. I also want to tell our viewers that Senate Select Committee Intelligence Acting Chairman Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, as well as the Vice Chairman, Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, released together a joint statement trying to say that our adversaries abroad seek to sow chaos and undermine voters' belief in our democratic institutions. But they said fundamentally, in these last days of election 2020, it's important for all Americans to know that election 2020 is, quote, safe, secure, and free from outside interference.